Hello and welcome back to the AI technical training. This is session 4. In this session, we're going to be looking at prompt engineering. Prompt engineering is the kind of science and the empirical way of improving the prompts that you feed into a model in a way that gets you the best possible output. So it's an iterative process that you repeat around and you test with data, which we'll go into in just a bit. And that way you can get the best performance out of a model for your particular use case. Now, we've often set homework at the end of the session, but in this instance, we're actually going to assign homework as we go along. So what I would like you to do in just a second is to pause the video and actually go away and find a test case for you to use during this session, and you can follow along as we do it. So just to give you a flavor of what I'm going to be doing, I've got the Trustpilot site for ChatGPT or chat.openai.com, and I'm going to be creating a prompt that will get the LLM to respond to user reviews as if we were OpenAI, writing back to what people have written. And it's going to be able to handle both positive, negative, and mixed reviews. So that's going to be the task that I'm going to give the AI, and I'm going to work through some prompt engineering techniques that will then lead to an optimized prompt to respond to these reviews. You can pick something that works for your use case, either for your own business or for some of the customers that you're looking to develop AI tools for. If you don't have one, then you can kind of make one up, but it works better if it's something that you're actually looking at doing, because part of the prompt engineering techniques is to use test data. So if you don't have test data, like here, I've got test data for ChatGPT, then this won't work as well. If you're really stuck, then you can do something similar, maybe pick a different company on Trustpilot. You can follow through the same use case, but ideally you want to pick something that you're working on, either for yourself or for a client. So I'm just going to pause for a few seconds, because I always watch videos like this and I never actually went away and did it. And I'm hoping that if I sit here in silence for 10 seconds, then that might give you the the impetus needed to actually pause the video, go away and find these examples and then come back. I think any more than 10 seconds I might start to feel a bit awkward, so I will just leave it for 10 seconds from now. And I'm hoping that you're going to actually go and find an example to follow along with, because this will be a lot more interactive if you do. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. All right, I think that's been 10 seconds. So I'm trusting you. I'm trusting that you've found something. Okay, so what is prompt engineering? So as I mentioned, prompt engineering is about iterating the prompt that you create and testing the prompt, because you need some empirical way of assessing whether the changes that you've made to a prompt is better or results in better output or worse output or the same output as what you had before. So you need some actual way of refining that prompt and testing that the prompt is actually improving over time. And then the goal is to get the best possible outputs from the model. And actually there's different ways of defining best or optimal. In a lot of cases, it is literally the best possible response in terms of quality, in terms of actually matching the output to the idealized input. But in other cases, you may be optimizing for latency. So you might want a super quick response. You might want a super short response if you're optimizing for cost. So the optimal endpoint that you're looking for isn't necessarily highest quality output, although in a lot of cases it can be. But just think through what you actually mean by optimal when you're starting to do this optimization and prompt engineering process. Interestingly enough, most of the time that you will spend is not actually in writing the various prompts. The majority of the time that you'll spend will be in actually picking representative samples that cover all kinds of edge cases, and actually evaluating the performance rather than actually writing the prompt. That's actually the quick bit. So the way that this process works is that we will develop some test cases. So ideally using real data, if you have that already. If not, then your best guess of what real data would look like. You'll then write a quick initial prompt. And what I'm going to ask you to do here is actually to write that initial prompt for your use case before we go any further. The reason that I ask you to do this is if we go through and review some of these prompt engineering techniques, then you're kind of going to have those in the back of your mind as you go through, and you're going to write a different initial prompt than you would have done if you hadn't actually seen the rest of this video. Obviously, if you've done some prompt engineering before, then you can kind of use those, you can bake these techniques in, but ideally your initial prompt would just be you typing out the simplest version of what you think will generate decent output for your use case. You then do this kind of repetition process here where you go around this bit time and time again. So you test the prompt. And what do I mean by test the prompt? Well, you test it against the test cases that you come up with. And the way that you do that evaluation can be in a number of different ways. It could be if it's something that has a definitive answer. So let's just say that it's a maths problem that has a obvious, well, not necessarily obvious, but it has a definitive answer where anything else is wrong. Then obviously you can test that against the definitive answer. And you can just do a very, very simple scoring system based on percentage correctness. And when you refine the prompt, you can chart those percentage differences. If it's something more subjective, like in this case, the way that we're responding to a customer review, then that might be something that you actually want humans to test against. So you might actually ask customer service representatives to grade the answers, and then actually sort of you can look at the evolution of those grades as time goes on. And by using the same test cases each time you go around this loop, you can see a definitive improvement, or in some cases maybe not an improvement, but you can kind of see the path of how those evaluations change over time. If you were to use different test cases every time, then you're going to lose that kind of thread as you go through. So it's about using the same test cases and the same evaluation metrics. So you'll always use the same metrics. So you wouldn't necessarily get a human to grade it the first time, a different set of humans in a completely different profession to grade it the second time. You see what I mean? You have to use the same method for grading each time, and that way you can see the evolution of the output as you change the prompt. You then refine the prompt using some of the techniques that we're going to cover here. And this is just a short introduction to prompt engineering. There are a lot more techniques, and I will point you to some resources that might be useful as we go through. Once you've got to a sufficient point, and that's up to you to define what you mean by sufficient. Again, if it's a math problem or a scientific problem that has not a definitive answer, then you might say, well, when it answers 90% of these correct, 95% of these correct, 99% of these correct, whatever your metric is, then I'm going to launch the prompt. If it's something that's more subjective, then you can say, oh, it's when 85% of the test subjects cannot tell it apart between a human response and an AI response, or when they think that the customer is going to be this happy with the response. So that's something that you need to develop before you go in. So it's always sort of very tempting just to look at it and say, yeah, that's good enough. But it makes a lot more sense if you have this kind of thought, or you've laid out what is an acceptable prompt before you start the process. It makes it less subjective and more scientific. So yeah, you can kind of see why most of the effort is actually spent in actually doing the evaluation rather than the actual writing of the prompts. Okay, so in terms of test case selection, what you want to do is you want to try and sample from real data. So in the case of this review of ChatGPT, then we have a really bad one, so a highly negative one. We have a kind of meh one. This is okay. It's not too bad, but here's some problems with it. So a middling one, and this one is saying, it's leaps and bounds in the AI world, but here's a tiny thing that's wrong with it. So you've got negative, kind of middle, and a positive review. So you can use as many test cases as you want. Obviously, the more you use, the longer it's going to take to kind of baseline this and actually come out with the optimal prompt. But you're probably going to be more accurate. But what's quite important is that this should be representative of the actual data that's in your data set. So you don't want anything synthetic if you can avoid it. And you want something that's going to cover any edge cases as well. So potentially if there's reviews that are, in my case, if there are reviews that use really bad language, then I might want to test the AI model's ability to cope with bad language in a patient, calm and friendly way. So I would include those edge cases as well. And just going back to this kind of bit here where we were sort of saying about launch prompt, that's not necessarily the end of the process. This is a malleable system. So when you get when your data kind of shifts and your edge cases change and the distribution of your data changes, you can come back and you can repeat this process with the new data, just to make sure that you're always keeping on top of the expected data as that changes over time. Okay, so these are the 3 reviews that I've picked. You should now pick, if you're following along, which I hope you are, you should now pick a representative sample of your data. You want at least 3 data points, ideally more, but I'm just going to pick 3 just for the quickness of showing this. And the more that you can get, the better. As long as you're not being repetitive, you don't want to sort of have something that's ever so slightly different, just with one word difference, because it's just going to take you more time to do that evaluation. So it's a balance between not enough and too much. Okay, so once you've picked your pieces of data that you're going to test with, you then want to prompt with the simplest prompt possible, or if you've done some prompt engineering techniques before, then you can kind of try and build those into your initial prompt. But I'm just going to literally just go to respond to the review provided by the user. And it's quite interesting because a lot of us, when we use LLMs, kind of would start with this, because you have the ability with something like ChatGPT, for example, to kind of go around and around and around. If it's not quite right the first time, then you can say, no, that wasn't right because of X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and it will then revise it, and you can do that again and again until it comes up with the optimal response. But when you're actually calling using the API, as we discussed in previous sessions, you can do this by what's called chaining. So you can kind of take the output from the LLM, put it into another prompt, take that, put it into another prompt, but that makes things significantly more complicated. So if it is possible to actually meet your objectives by just doing a single call to the API, then that's what you should do. But you haven't got that ability to go round and round. So this might be a good way of actually initiating a session with ChatGPT, because you've got that ability to then have that conversation. But this probably isn't going to be good enough for what we're trying to do. And you kind of have this model of a person. So if I said this to like some of the best colleagues, then they would just take this task and they would run with it, and they'd know exactly what I meant, and they would just be optimal at it. Whereas if I said it to other people, then they might actually need a bit more prompting, literally, just like the LLM does. So you kind of have to balance it, and we'll see how that looks as we go along. So let's try it with this, which is respond to the review provided by the user. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to be using Claude for this, but obviously you can use the LLM of your choice. And I'm using their console here. So the system prompt is respond to the review provided by the user. And I'm just going to take my first one here and hit run. And you can obviously automate this, but we're just going to do it interactively just in this video. Okay, so that's not actually a bad start. It's kind of got what we were looking for. I'm actually quite impressed with that as a first kind of test. So the main thing that you want to do is you want to log these. I'm not going to be doing the evaluation as part of this. I'm just going to be covering the techniques. But as I mentioned, you need to log all of the responses versus all of the inputs, so that you can do that evaluation either through a human, or actually you can potentially get another LLM to rate the output. But you need to very carefully engineer that prompt as well, which makes things a bit more difficult. But anyway, this was the output from the first negative review. Let's try this one. So this one has acknowledged the fact that they've mentioned that the servers are innovative, and then they're now addressing the particular point that they've made, which is pretty good. So this is kind of now actually taking it as though it's an LLM. If you look at the way that this is responded, you raise a great point about my knowledge cutoff. The developers made the decision to limit my training data. I agree that having more current information could allow me to be even more helpful. So this is actually answering as though it is the LLM and not the company that's behind the LLM. So that's an interesting thing there, is that it's now acting as though it's the system rather than the company. So that's something that isn't captured in this very, very simple prompt. And let's now do review 3. So this is acknowledge the positive review and the feedback about the pricing. Be sure to pass your comments along to the appropriate teams. I mean, we didn't ask it to do that, but that could be a nice thing. But obviously, if it's going to be responding with stuff like that, then it needs to actually have a method of acting upon that. Because, you know, if it's something that's passed along, you actually do want it to be passed along. Okay, so that was the kind of very, very simple prompt. That was prompt number 1. We're now going to be looking at a way of improving those initial instructions, and that is by being clear and direct. There isn't really a fancy name for this. Some of these techniques have fancy names. There isn't really a fancy name for this. It's literally just clear and direct. So you can kind of imagine that you've got a new starter at your company. They don't sort of know the process. They're eager to please, and you know they're pretty intelligent, but actually they don't really know your kind of house style. They don't know the branding guidelines that they need to follow. They don't know the tone of voice, all of that kind of stuff. So how would you direct someone new to your company? And that's kind of what you're doing by being clear and concise. You want to give as much detail and context as possible. Obviously, don't paste in a 20-page process manual because you're just going to pollute the context. The context length. You're going to use up a lot of tokens in doing that. So it's a lot of detail without being overly verbose. And then, so this is the point I was saying before. So you can't go back around. So, you know, if you were training up a new colleague, then you would kind of see, oh, look, they've made some mistakes. Then you can have a nice conversation with them and correct that and keep on doing that process. Whereas you need to try and bake everything into this clear and direct part that you possibly can. And a good litmus test for this is to show the set of instructions that you make to a friend or colleague. Maybe even ask them to do the task by following those instructions. If they become confused or if they're like, this doesn't make any sense to me, then it probably won't do to the LLM. So that's a good kind of benchmark, is actually showing these instructions to someone you trust and saying, does this make sense to you? So we've actually now told the model what's going to happen. So the user will provide a review of the company from a customer. So they know that it's about the company and it's from, and then basically who it's from. So rather than just respond to the review provided by the user, we're clear now that the user is an actual customer, a user of the product, and what is being reviewed is the company. Draft a response to the review in an answer section, and I will explain what I mean by that when we actually get to the practical and we paste the prompt in and we see what happens. So in the response, you want to thank the reviewer for taking the time to share their experience, and to be fair, they kind of actually did this already. We appreciate your honest feedback. Oops. Open the dictionary, let's close that. Here, thank you for your feedback. Here, thank you for your positive review. So that was kind of happening already, but this makes it explicit. Just because it's happening in these 3 reviews doesn't mean that it's going to happen in every piece of output. So we want to thank the reviewer for taking the time and making sure that's in there, because that is the company policy. Say, for instance, that's what we actually want to see. We want to acknowledge any positive points they raise and express gratitude for the kind words. And again, it kind of did that anyway, but we want to make that explicit. If they raise any negative points, humbly acknowledge them, apologise for any shortcomings and offer conciliation or propose a remedy if possible. Maintain a friendly, empathetic and professional tone, even if the review is highly negative or emotionally charged. That's one thing that we haven't tested. So as I was saying about edge cases, one thing we haven't got is we haven't got someone ranting and swearing and cursing and whatever else. So we can't test how it responds to that. Ideally, you know, if that's in your input data set, then you need to make sure that that's tested for in your test prompts. And keep your response concise, but make sure to address the key points. Okay, write your response inside the answer tag. Remember, the goal is to make the customer feel heard and respected while putting the company's best foot forward. So basically, we're saying there, don't just overly apologise and say it was all our fault, because you know you might then admit liability, or the LLM is admitting liability on your behalf. You're still trying to represent the interests of the company while not belittling or patronising the customer, etc. So let's paste this in. And we're going to replace the super short prompt here, and let's go back to review number 1, the negative review. Great. Okay. Let's see how this goes on. Okay, so we've now got these answer tags, and actually this isn't kind of needed right now, but it will become apparent as to why we've got these in just a second. This is kind of like this is quite a Claude specific thing. These are from a language called XML. You don't have to look that up, but this is a way of kind of chopping up the answer or a response into various sections. And there's a reason that we'll do that, which you'll see in just a moment. So what's kind of different here? Thank you for sharing the feedback, which is exactly what we asked it to do. We appreciate you bringing this. We apologise. You're absolutely right that this should do this. It's frustrating. So there's kind of empathising here. And then also, please do actually connect with us, and thank you again. And again, I'm not a customer service expert, so actually I'm not in a position to judge which of these two responses is better. I'm just sort of taking you through the process of how to do this, but this is something that you would show to your customer service teams, for example, and actually get them to kind of rate the difference between these two, and then that will then inform how you then go from here in terms of actually progressing to the next prompt in the sequence. Let's try this one, which is the middling one. Now notice that we've actually gone, because we've added in all these additional instructions and we made it clear that this is the company that's responding, we've now lost this I am the AI, I am responding as the AI thing here. So now it's being responded to as this is the company talking about its AI rather than the AI talking about itself. So that is clearly better than the first prompt. And then for the third one, okay, so now we see why we've got the answer tags. This was definitely going to come up in the next prompt, but actually it's just spontaneously come up in this one. So you see here that the AI has said, here is my draft response to the review. And if I was to take this and put this back in the review page, I'm going to get, here is my draft response to the review, and then I'm going to get the review, which isn't what we want at all, because that's going to make it obvious that it's being generated by an AI. So by putting it in the answer tag, you can then use software, or you can use what's called a string manipulation technique to find this answer and find this close answer and pull out the stuff that's in between, which means that you're going to end up with this stuff here. So actually I'm going to do that on the other two because the answer tags themselves aren't part of the answer. They are just kind of like the delimiter, as we call it, that kind of separates the answer from the other stuff. And then in review number 3, the response to that is just this stuff in between. So you'll see this more clearly in the next section, but this answer tag enables you to just pull out the answer even if the AI has written loads of other stuff at the beginning or the end. Let's just see. Thank you so much. Yep. Thanks for your feedback. Thanks for being a valued customer. Yep, okay, that seems good to me. Again, you need an expert to review this ideally. So now let's move on to the next prompting technique that we can then add into this. So this is called the scratch pad, otherwise known as chain of thought. Chain of thought is a slightly more formal way, and it's sometimes this will fall into chain of thought, sometimes it won't. So scratch pad, I guess in this case, is probably the more informal way of saying it. Chain of thought is a slightly more formal way of saying it. But essentially this, when the AI starts outputting, it's just going to go blah. Okay, here's the answer. Word, and as you saw from previous ones, they are next token predictors. So here's the next token, here's the next token, here's the next token. And if they, because of the temperature that you've set, if they go down slightly the wrong path, then they're going to diverge off a long way in the wrong direction. So we can help them by basically giving them a space where they can actually think before they answer. So it gives them the time and the kind of token space to actually put some thinking into their responses before they do the final output. So it's equivalent of saying to a person, don't just open your mouth, think before you speak. In this case, it's actually, it's not necessarily think before you speak, it's kind of think it through or think it out, because the LLM can't actually think privately. So it can't just think about it and then talk. It has to actually output the tokens that make up its thinking. So you are going to see that thinking in the response. And this is why we've now got the answer section, so that we can separate the thinking that it's doing to the actual response that it's coming up with. So the downside of this is that it's going to significantly increase the output length, because it's got that additional section where it's done the pre-thinking, and the latency as well, because it's got to generate a load more tokens before it gets through to doing the answer. So again, this is a trade-off, and this is why we do this step, going right back to the beginning. This is why we do the test, refine, test, refine, test, refine, because you might actually use this scratchpad technique and then realize it's only improving it by subjective this amount, or it's only improving it by objective this percentage, depending on your use case. It's not actually worth the additional latency and the additional tokens. But again, that's a case-by-case thing. That's why it's important to actually set out the metrics that you're going to use to evaluate the output from the prompts before you start this process. Anyway, so we've got the initial step here. The user will provide a review, dictionary again, sorry about that. The user will provide a review of the company from the customer. We've got all of this stuff, which is the same. Now, the next bit is this part here. First, write down your thoughts and reactions to the review in a thoughts section. Identify the key points the reviewer made, both positive and negative, and then think about how to craft an appropriate response. So it's going to do some pre-thinking before it gives us the output. So let's see how that looks in practice. Let's go back to the reviews, and let's take the bad review. All right, let's see what this comes out. So here we go. We've got some thinking here. The reviewer expresses significant frustration with the premium version of the product, noting that it seems to have gotten worse in the past 6 months. The key issues are. So it's actually pulled out the key issues that the person has said. The free version often provides better answers than the premium. This review highlights some serious product quality and customer satisfaction issues that need to be acknowledged and addressed. The response should validate their frustration, apologise for the shortcomings, and offer some conciliation. So it's actually planned its response before it's actually going to even respond. And now you can see why we've got the answer section. It's actually separated that from the thought section at the beginning. And when we actually come to processing the response, we can just pull out the answers without having to worry about having to do anything complicated if we weren't having those separators. So thank you for taking the time to share your honest feedback about our product. I apologise for frustration and issues. So again, is this better than number 2? That's where you'd have to have someone who is an expert in this evaluating it. But I mean, I think that's a pretty good response. If anything, I think all of these responses are a little bit long, but that's something, again, you can fine-tune with the prompting and the clear and direct section. Rather than saying keep your response concise, you can say keep it this many sentences. Okay, let's just quickly do that for the other 2. Just so that we've got them all written down. Okay, now we've got the thought section. They gave positive feedback, but they pointed out that this, to respond I should, and now it's got this great plan of action, maintaining a grateful, humble and receptive tone, expressing appreciation, etc. The idea to give the AI access to the internet to get up-to-date information is an intriguing one. I mean, obviously, you know that AIs now can do that, but I guess at the time that this review was written, that wasn't actually a thing. Okay. And again, review number 3. And as I mentioned, I'm basically, because I'm not doing this for real, I'm just copying and pasting these answers into this text document. But you probably want to come up with a bit of a more sophisticated way of doing this, whether it's a spreadsheet or whether you actually write some code to actually track the answers and enable people to review them. I'm not going to read through all of this, but obviously if you wanted to, you're more than welcome to pause and you can compare to the previous answers. Okay, and that was the scratchpad or chain of thought technique. Let's now move on to the last prompt engineering technique, which I'm going to cover in this video, which is few-shot learning. Or few-shot prompting, rather. So that's a very, very technical way of saying, give it some examples. So compared to zero-shot or one-shot, so zero-shot is basically everything that we've done so far. It's doing it, it's working it out for itself from scratch. One-shot is you give it an example. Few-shot is you give it several curated, picked examples. So this is one of the most powerful techniques because you're essentially kind of teaching it how you want it to respond, not just by giving it clear and direct instructions like this, but you're actually giving it some examples of some reviews and the responses that you want to see. So it's basically like teaching a person by allowing them to look over your shoulder as you're doing the work and actually observe and then try and imitate what you're doing and then giving them feedback and then sort of going round and round. So the important concepts that are needed when actually looking at few-shot learning is making sure that you pick relevant examples. So they need to be as close to the real world as possible. So obviously in this case we can actually pick real reviews and we can get someone to write responses. In this case I've got the AI to write a response, but ideally you would pick a model response that you get your top customer service person to respond to in the best possible way, exactly how you want them to respond, and then use that as an example. So they need to be relevant examples, they need to be diverse, so different scenarios. So obviously you need a mixture of positive, middling and negative reviews, edge cases, as I mentioned, bad language, how do you respond to bad language. Basically everything that you want to cover in your data set needs to be included in the examples. And you want at least 3 to 5, minimum 3, covering a diverse set. 5 would be good, but more isn't necessarily better. Once you get to like 50 or 60, it's not going to actually add much more, and you're going to be using up a lot of context space, that input length, and you kind of start actually confusing the models, because even if they have a context length, say that advertisers having like 128k context length, you find that they do actually kind of start to forget things that are earlier on in the input or in the middle of the input. So you want to optimize to having high quality, medium quantity set of examples. So now we've got exactly the same thing as we had here. So we've got the introduction, we've got the thoughts section, we've got the answer section, then we've got the examples, and this is using this kind of XML method that I was mentioning before, which Claude in particular really enjoys. It really actually helps to break things up for it because it was trained on a lot of XML documents, so it understands the structure. So I've got, not to go too far into the technical details, but you can see I've got examples here, and then in each example, in the examples outer thing, so I've got examples and then this ends here with a /examples, so similar to HTML if you've actually used HTML. Then in each one I've got an example which has the review and the response broken up into blocks. So I've got 3 examples here, and this way Claude will very, very easily be able to understand where the examples end, the responses begins and ends as well. And then we've got the kind of the end statement, which we pulled out to the bottom. Write your response in answer tags, so just to remind it what it's supposed to be doing. And again, you can play with the ordering of this. So you could put the examples at the beginning, you could then put the clear and concise bit at the end. You can move all of this stuff around, and then that does actually affect the output. So remember what I was saying about it doesn't actually take a huge amount of time to write the prompts, it's the testing that takes the time, because even the positioning of this stuff in the actual prompt makes a huge difference. Anyway, let's go back and see what this does. So this is now a huge input prompt. So remember that is actually going to cost, because it's going to have to do the processing on that every single time. So you need to look at the benefit of that over the cost. Let's try with a negative response. Move this out of the way. So we've got the thoughts. Again, this is doing the thoughts. And we don't obviously get any output for the examples because it's literally just taking that into consideration when it writes its response. But we've now got an answer. And I'm not sure if this is going to be significantly better because I sort of very quickly used AI to write my examples, whereas you would want to sort of really carefully curate those based on expert input. So I'm just going to paste this in, just so if you are tracking along, you can see the difference. And I'm just going to do review 2 and review 3 just to finish everything off. And hopefully, if you are following along, you've now got a bit of a library of examples, and you've got a library of prompt techniques that you've kind of curated based on the examples I've given. sure there will be an opportunity in one of the sessions Alex runs to kind of share the experiences and the learnings that you've got from that. Which of these techniques actually works the best for you, which ones didn't work so well, which ones significantly improved the output, which ones didn't really make a difference. It'll be really interesting to hear from you what your specific use case is and how some of these techniques have helped, or maybe not, and any kind of techniques that you've potentially come up with yourself that we haven't covered here that you found particularly useful. All of that would be really, really interesting to discuss in one of those Tuesday sessions once you've had the chance to run through and do this for yourself. But this is the kind of thing that you can spend endless amounts of time on just tweaking, and this is why you need a metric to actually say, I'm done. This prompt is good enough, the output is good enough. Otherwise, you could just spend longer doing it. And this is interesting. Why don't we have sorry to interrupt myself, we don't actually have a thoughts section on this. And again, this is why it's good to actually test all this stuff, because it's been specifically instructed to put a thought section in, and it hasn't. Let me run it again. Yeah, we don't have a thought section. See, this is the thing, even when you're actually really, really deep into prompting, it doesn't necessarily actually listen to you. It can be quite temperamental, and we've even got this little sign-off thing here, wishing you all the best, company name. Interesting. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that you would have to debug. So like if I let me just try this quickly just as an experiment. If I take this and put this at the bottom, now because it's more recent in the input, is it going to now abide by that thought section or not? Okay, there we go. This is what I was saying about ordering, and it's great to actually have a live validation of what I was saying. Now I've actually put this section which talks about the thoughts. It's now doing it, whereas before it wasn't, and that was because obviously the examples part was more recent, and it's similar to human psychology where you have primacy and recency. The things you were told first and the things that you were told most recently you remember better than all the stuff you were told in the middle, which is why presenters are told to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them again what you told them, just to make sure that information is top of mind and most recent in mind, and all the stuff in the middle kind of gets forgotten. There's probably a similar process going on with the LLMs as well, but the stuff that is most recent in the input stream is the stuff that they tend to focus in on most. But again, that's an experiment that you can do with ordering. Now, this is by no means the only prompt engineering techniques that you can use, but I'm hoping that this has given you a good overview of the process that you would use, some of the techniques that you can use and you can mix and match, and the way that you actually evaluate the output, and the ways that you actually pick your test cases, etc. And as I say, it'll be very interesting to hear from you once you've run through this, your experiences of these various techniques on one of the Tuesday calls. One thing I will share with you here is very simple. This is promptingguide.ai. I actually came across this. I thought actually there's probably some more resources that I can share. Came across this, and I'm pleased that like a lot of the ones that I covered are in here, and there's also a lot of other things that I didn't cover in here. So for example, let's just pick one. Here's chain of thought, for example, few shot prompting with the example. So all of this is covered, and it goes into potentially more detail about how you might use it, with references and who came up with this, and if you really want to, the academic papers that you can go into, how to chain prompts. This was the thing that I was talking about, where you take the output and you feed it back into the input of another prompt, the more complicated method. So pretty much everything here is covered, even these very, very more advanced prompt engineering topics that you might want to use as well. So you've got the techniques, which is what we've kind of covered today. You've got different ways of actually using prompts. We'll talk about some of these like function calling, etc., and RAG in future lessons. What else do we have here? Basics of prompting, and this also probably tells you about things like temperature. Yeah, okay, cool. So as I mentioned before, you have temperature. Temperature also plays in with the prompts, so you probably want to play with this at different temperature settings as well, which gives you a kind of explosion of different ways of testing this. And then we've also got cool. So we've got like a section at the bottom here for different methods. So question answering, text summarization. So we might actually have some decent prompts. Okay, so we've got some example prompts as well of ways of answering different use cases, and the way that you might want to prompt engineer those based on model methods. And we should also have, yep, cool, we've got a section here as well that kind of gives you information about different models. We've covered this before, how to evaluate the models, but hopefully this also gives you an example of how to prompt specifically different models, because the way that you prompt Claude is different to the way that you prompt GPT-4, is different from the way that you prompt Llama, etc. So this should be a really, really good resource. And yeah, as I mentioned, have a play, and looking forward to hearing about your experiences with prompt engineering. And I will catch you next time.